Welcome to Retro Reads, where timeless mysteries come to life. Today, a new case awaits, full of twists, secrets, and thrilling revelations. Settle in, relax, and let the adventure begin. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and at what time. Let's get started and dive into this unforgettable story. That morning, Nero Wolfe was communing with a Cattletonia hybrid that had refused for 6 weeks to bloom. I was standing near the humidifier in the orchid room, arms crossed, trying not to breathe too hard and disturb the delicate environment. The place was balmy, and Wolfe was cross with the plant for not responding to his latest coaxing, a shift in potassium levels that had him convinced would yield results. "Phui," he muttered, inspecting the unopened bud with a lens. "Stubborn, unreceptive, and unworthy of its genus." "Sounds like Inspector Kramer," I offered, which earned me a flat glance over his shoulder. Orchid maintenance had a sacred schedule, and barring murder or arson on the front steps, nothing was supposed to interfere with it. I had, over time, perfected the art of appearing engaged without actually caring which member of the orchid family was being scolded. It was nearing 10:30 when Fritz's footsteps entered the outer hall, urgent enough to ripple the stillness through the glass doors. Wolfe's brow compressed. Fritz never entered the orchid room during the sacred hours unless something was either burning or bleeding. He appeared at the doorway with a troubled look and a tray bearing a note, a folded newspaper, and a chilled carafe of tomato juice. Wolfe straightened. "Something has occurred?" he asked. Fritz nodded gravely. "Yes, sir, a violation, and not only of good taste." Back in the office, Wolfe had his girth comfortably distributed in the red leather chair, the orchid frustrations momentarily forgotten. Fritz, uncharacteristically rattled, stood by my desk, one hand gripping the back of the chair like it might steady his nerves. "It was the truffle cheese," he said, with the seriousness of someone announcing a diplomatic assassination. "Gone, stolen, sliced clean from the case." Wolfe blinked. "From where?" "Rigoletto's Delicatessen, on East 57th, the only place in the city that carries the truffle-matured Pecorino di Pietra. Dante had it marked for me. I was to pick it up this morning." "Dante?" I asked. "The clerk," Fritz replied. "Young, efficient, quiet." "He's not there," Fritz continued. "The shop was broken into last night. Nothing taken but the cheese, no cash, no register tampering, just the truffle wedge gone, and a note." He handed it over. A single sheet folded twice with block letters scrawled in red marker. "Close your case or you'll be next." Wolfe frowned at the unfortunate pun. Threatening and ungrammatical. I turned to Fritz. "Was the case open?" "No," Fritz said quickly. "The door was intact, no sign of forced entry. But the back storage cooler was ajar and Dante hasn't shown up. Marion, Mr. Rigoletto's niece, was the one who called me. She found the shop like that when she opened." Wolfe exhaled through his nose. "A theft," he murmured, "that excludes money and targets cheese. That's either madness or an advertisement." She arrived not an hour later, trim and serious in a grey coat, a felt cloche pulled down over dark curls. Marion Volo shook my hand with a firm grip and looked me squarely in the eye. That always earns a point in my book. Fritz brought tea on a tray, which she politely ignored. "Mr. Wolfe, I know how particular you are about your time," she began, "and I know this may seem trivial, but I wouldn't be here if it were only about cheese." Wolfe, behind his desk, steepled his fingers. "Miss Volo, in my experience, things rarely begin with what they're about." She nodded once. "The theft was deliberate. They took only the truffle cheese, left everything else untouched. But it wasn't just product that disappeared. She hesitated, then continued. Dante Pierce is missing. He closed up last night and hasn't been seen since. His apartment's untouched, phone unanswered. He's never been late, never missed a shift. I asked, was he in any kind of trouble? She gave a tight shrug. Not that I know, but there's more. In the office, after the break-in, I found something. I didn't tell the police. I thought, you should see it first. From her handbag, she produced a small plastic vial, half full, amber-coloured, unmarked. She placed it on Wolfe's desk like a lit stick of dynamite. Dante had it locked in his drawer, she said. It wasn't there yesterday. Wolfe picked it up delicately. Truffle oil, perhaps? Maybe, she said, but it smelled wrong, bitter. There was silence for a moment. Then Wolfe said, Miss Volo, you are correct. This is not about cheese. If Marion Volo had been the only inducement, Wolfe might have passed. He'd had clients with tear-streaked affidavits and corpses in the drawing room, and still declined. But then Fritz from the sideboard cleared his throat and said, Rigoletto's is the only supplier in the city who carries Ortiz anchovies in oil from Cantabria. The Spanish shipment arrives next week. Wolfe froze, his lips tightened. Pfui! He stared at the vial again, then at the note, and finally at the tea Marion had left untouched. Slowly, he turned his bulk in the chair. Very well, he said. Mr. Goodwin will visit the premises. You'll give him addresses, names, and anything else he needs. Of course, Marion replied, visibly relieved. I got out my notebook, already thinking ahead to which tie I'd ruin in a storage cooler. Wolfe was still frowning, but I knew the look. A man may be immune to sentiment and untouched by the desperation of a missing clerk, but threaten his anchovy supply and he'll declare war. As Marion departed and Fritz went to prepare lunch, Wolfe picked up the vial once more and held it to the light. Cheese, he muttered. Ridiculous. He didn't put it down for a full 5 minutes. I arrived at Rigoletto's Delicatessen on East 57th just past noon, disguised as a man with a clipboard and an interest in smoked paprika. Wolfe had supplied me with the name of a legitimate specialty supplier we occasionally used for oddball condiments, and Marion had scribbled a few notes on store layout and key staff. The plan was simple. I'd pose as a rep checking client demand for small batch Iberian imports, nose around, and see if I could stir any loose talk from the help. The shop itself was modest, family-run, and clean enough to pass Fritz's fussy standards. A glass counter stretched across the front, with a chalkboard above listing the day's offerings: duck liver pâté, Calabrian olives, and smoked boar sausage. Behind it stood Mr. Rigoletto himself, looking like a man born to weigh Gruyère. He was gruff but polite, and didn't bat an eye when I introduced myself as Andrew Griffin from Delmar Foods. "You're the second vendor this week," he grunted. "Not buying, not until I figure out what's going on." I leaned on the counter. "What is going on?" He hesitated. Then, in a voice lower than his usual tenor, he said, "Dante's gone, left no note. The cooler door was open, and my niece says someone rifled the drawer." I asked if he'd called the police. He nodded. "They're poking around, but they think it's just a walk-off. I know Dante, he didn't just leave." I let that settle, then casually gestured toward the cold case. Nice inventory. Was the truffle cheese stored there? His eyes flicked toward the empty tray near the end. "That's where it was. Gone clean." We chatted a few more minutes, mostly fluff, until a thin young man in a white apron came out from the back and gave me a look like he'd tasted spoiled ricotta. I thanked Rigoletto and left, but not before taking a slow walk behind the counter. Near the leg of the shelving, half buried in dust and bits of wax paper, was a small glass vial, It smelled faintly of fungus and something acrid. I took out my handkerchief, wrapped it carefully, and slipped it into my coat pocket. As I left the shop, I called Wolfe from the first available phone booth. He answered after 2 rings. "Goodwin. I have the vial and a name, Dante Pierce, still missing." "Return," Wolfe said. "Bring the vial." He hung up. I wasn't surprised. Nothing wakes Wolfe's appetite for deduction like a foul-smelling bottle and a missing man with a fine taste in cheese. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe examined the vial with a sniff, then passed it to Fritz, who confirmed what we all suspected. It wasn't standard truffle oil. "There's something wrong," Fritz murmured. "It's sharp, metallic. I'd never use this." Wolfe nodded once, then turned to me. "The rival shop, across from Rigoletto's. Did you notice it?" "I did," I said. "Clean, flashy. It's called Carmel's Fine Imports. The window displays make Rigoletto's look like a soup kitchen." "Owner?" "Leo Carmel. Tall, neat beard, likes to wear vests. Reputation for charm and ego in equal parts." Wolfe gestured toward the phone on my desk. "Saul." That was all. I dialed Saul Panzer, who picked up in 4 rings with his usual efficiency. I gave him the name, address, and the bare essentials. Saul didn't need coaching. I asked him to begin quiet observation. No contact, just pattern analysis. Carmel's associates, deliveries, off-hours visits, all of it. "Got it," he said. "I'll call in tonight." I hung up and looked at Wolfe. "Do you think Carmel's behind it?" I asked. "I think," Wolfe said slowly, "that someone used the theft to conceal something more odious. If Mr. Carmel is responsible, he will reveal himself soon enough. If not, Saul will tell us who is." He rose from his chair with difficulty, the vial still in his hand. "Until then, I must prepare the stomach. Fritz, cold chicken and sauerkraut. Mr. Goodwin, remain available." "Always am," I said, "especially when lunch is involved." After I finished my second cup of Wolfe's preferred Indonesian blend, I figured it was time to make another round on East 57th. This time, I walked into Carmel's Fine Imports with no clipboard, no alias, and no illusions of subtlety. Carmel's was sleek and modern, the kind of place that arranged figs like Fabergé eggs. The shelves gleamed, the tile floors glistened, and the clerk behind the counter had a beard so symmetrical it looked licensed. Leo Carmel himself wasn't there, but I made nice with the help and poked around just enough to be noticed. After a few minutes of mild questions and fewer answers, I stepped back out and strolled into the alley behind the shops. A cigarette vendor, loitering by the loading dock, had a story to share. For the price of 2 lucky strikes and a promise not to repeat his name, he mentioned something peculiar. "FDA was here Monday," he said, tapping ash onto his shoe. "Showed up like hornets, went through Carmel's like they were hunting diamonds, all clipboard and attitude." "Routine?" he snorted. "Nothing's routine when it comes with flashlights and gloves. Hadn't seen 'em in months before that." I thanked him, filed the detail, and moved on. Back at Rigoletto's, I asked Marion if they'd had any inspections lately. She shook her head. "Not in over a year. We're due, but nothing scheduled." I let her words hang while I studied the ledger behind the counter again. The lines were neat, the columns crisp, but something tugged at the back of my mind. A ledger tells you what's there. Sometimes it also tells you what's missing. I didn't mention the FDA yet, not until I had something better than sidewalk gossip. But in Wolfe's world, timing was never irrelevant, and inspections didn't bloom coincidentally across the street from missing clerks and truffle oil sabotage. I was about to head out when a stack of inventory slips fell from the shelf behind the counter. Marion knelt to help gather them, and that's when I spotted it, tucked against the wall near the refrigeration unit, just behind a box of canned anchovies, a second vial. Unlike the one I'd found earlier, this one was open and empty. No label, slight oil residue lining the bottom. I didn't touch it. Marion saw my stare and followed it. "That wasn't there yesterday," she said quietly. "No," I agreed. "And you keep this shelf stocked daily?" "Every morning." I fished out a clean handkerchief from my coat and carefully wrapped the vial before slipping it into my inside pocket. I had a growing suspicion Wolfe would want to compare it to the first and possibly subject them both to something sterner than Fritz's nose. "Anything else go missing?" I asked. She shook her head. "Just the truffle cheese. That particular wheel had arrived last week. We were saving it for a private order." "From Fritz?" "Yes." I gave her a faint smile and turned toward the cooler. The shelf it stood on had two small bolts anchoring it to the wall. One was loose, and wedged behind it was the torn corner of a delivery receipt, barely legible but stamped with yesterday's date. I left it where it was and made a mental note. You didn't need fingerprints in Wolfe's world, you needed threads. And this one was starting to stretch in an uncomfortable direction. Back in the shop's office, Marion let me flip through the ledger under the pretense of reviewing product margins, which meant she knew I was snooping and wasn't going to stop me. The book was thorough, handwritten with a steady hand, columns labelled meticulously, and each page initialed at the bottom. But one date stood out: last Friday. There was no entry for it. The ledger went from Thursday straight to Saturday, like Friday had taken a personal day and never returned. I asked Marion if she kept backup records. "Dante handled Friday's deliveries," she said. "He always did end of week alone, said it helped him think." "Anything unusual about that day?" She hesitated. "Only that he was quiet. Distracted." "Did he ever lock the drawer in the office?" "Only once that I recall, last Friday." It added up too neatly for comfort. The missing page, the locked drawer, the vanishing act. Dante hadn't just disappeared. He'd left a trail and someone had tried to snip it mid-stride. I copied down the surrounding ledger entries, careful not to alert Rigoletto, and pocketed the notes. Then I thanked Marion and headed for the brownstone. Wolfe would want to see the gap in ink, and maybe, just maybe, he'd start to see what Dante had seen before someone decided to shut him up. And I had a gut feeling it hadn't been the cheese that got him killed. The call came just after 7 a.m., a time Wolfe considered barbaric for any communication not related to breakfast. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when I picked up the phone. Saul's voice was low and clipped. "They found him," he said. "Dante?" "Yeah. Cold storage unit in the back of Carmel's warehouse. Dead." I sat up straighter. "Who found him?" "City Health. They were doing a routine check. Follow-up to Monday's inspection. Got curious about some temperature inconsistencies on the records. Broke open a locked unit. Dante was in there, dead at least 3 days, 'cause not official yet." "Any signs?" "There was cheese," Saul said, "wrapped in wax paper, sitting in the corner near his head. Looked like someone wanted to send a message." "Cheese as a calling card," I muttered. "Now I've seen everything. I'll send you the exact address." I thanked him and hung up, then rapped on the door to the dining room where Wolfe was battling a stubborn egg. "Something disagreeable?" he asked without looking up. "Dante's been found," I said. "Dead. Locked in a cold unit at Carmel's warehouse. Health department found him." That got his attention. He laid down his fork. "What else?" "Cheese was with the body, same kind, same cut, same truffle profile if you ask me. I'm going down there now." He nodded once. "Mr. Goodwin, bring back a sample, not the corpse, the cheese." I left immediately. The warehouse was cordoned off, but Saul had a word with one of the inspectors, and they allowed me a brief look. The temperature in the locker was low enough to burn your lungs. Dante was curled against the far wall, still in his apron. Near him sat a neat wedge of pale speckled pecorino wrapped in familiar wax paper. No rodents, no smearing. Someone had placed it there with deliberation. I didn't need a label, it was the exact same cut Fritz had raved about. I swiped the smallest crumb I could get away with and packed it in the tube Wolfe had given me. Back at the brownstone, I handed him the sample. He didn't touch it. He just looked at it and said, "There will be poison." Wolfe, contrary to what many might believe, was no stranger to science. He merely preferred it in support of deduction, not as its master. That morning he summoned Doctor Volney from across town, a man with the wit of a wasp and the bedside manner of an undertaker. Volney arrived just after 10, tall and bony, in a coat that had outlived 3 presidents. Wolfe handed him both vials, the oil I'd retrieved from Rigoletto's and the newer sample from the warehouse. "And this," Wolfe said, indicating the crumb of cheese preserved in a sterile jar. "Tell me what's in it." Volney sniffed, frowned, and opened his briefcase. "How long in cold storage?" "Approximately 72 hours, Wolfe replied. "Contamination is probable," Volney said, "but deliberate contamination, that I can find." He worked in silence for 20 minutes, while Wolfe sat like a stone, and I tried not to sneeze from the fumes. At the end of it, Volney exhaled through his nose and straightened up. "There's botulinum present," he said. "Rare strain, toxic in small doses. The cheese is only a carrier. The real punch came from the truffle compound infused into it." "Infused," Wolfe echoed. "Yes, this was no accident. The oil acted as a vehicle. Bacteria survives in the anaerobic conditions of improperly stored truffle infusions. Someone knew exactly what they were doing." Wolfe gave a small grunt, and his gaze shifted to me. "The first vial?" "Came from Rigoletto's back room," I said. "The second was from behind the counter, both within reach of Dante." Volney added, "If Dante tasted this, he might not have died immediately, but death would have followed within hours. Or," he looked pointedly at Wolfe, "he may not have eaten it at all. Someone else may have used it to kill and planted the rest." "That," Wolfe said slowly, "is the question." He dismissed Volney with a curt nod and didn't speak again until the front door clicked shut. Then he turned his head toward me. "Mr. Goodwin, fetch Saul. And the girl." "Marion?" "Yes." "She has withheld something." I lifted an eyebrow. "You sure?" "No," Wolfe said, "but she's afraid. And someone has made her so." That was all the proof I needed. I reached for the phone and started dialing. By the time Marion arrived at the brownstone, Wolfe had already taken his seat behind the desk, glowering at the wax-sealed jar that now sat beside the first 2 vials. I ushered her into the red chair, where she folded her gloved hands tightly in her lap. She looked tired. Not the fatigue of missed sleep, but the drawn, brittle look of someone whose certainty had been cracked open. Wolfe studied her with the dispassion of a botanist observing a diseased leaf. "Miss Volo," he began, "why did you conceal the vial from the police?" Her eyes flicked to me and back. "I thought it might be nothing." "You thought," he said, "or you feared?" I didn't know what to think." "You knew the theft was staged." She blinked. "Staged?" "Yes. The absence of forced entry, the narrow focus of the theft, the precision of its execution. It was not a burglary. It was theatre, carefully composed, artfully misleading. The cheese was not stolen for its value. It was stolen to create a narrative." She hesitated. "To frame someone." Wolfe nodded once. "Precisely. And if Mr. Pierce had left no note, no threat, no confession, we might accept the tale at face value. But Mr. Goodwin recovered more than a cheese rind. He found a trail." She turned to me, startled. "What trail?" I filled her in about the ledger, the loose shelf bolt, the hidden vial, and the absence of Friday's entries. She sat still for a long moment. "He said he was scared," she murmured. "2 days before he vanished. Said he'd found something he shouldn't have." Wolfe closed his eyes briefly. "Then we are late." "But not too late," I said. "Perhaps," Wolfe conceded. "But now we must confirm what was found, and who wanted it buried." He pressed the buzzer for Fritz. "Bring tea. Miss Voller will need it." Dr. Volney returned that evening with a thin folder tucked under his arm and a look that suggested he had spent the entire afternoon confirming what he already suspected. He removed his gloves carefully, seated himself in the yellow chair, politely refusing Fritz's offer of broth, and opened the folder. "I conducted a comparative analysis of both vials," he began, addressing Wolfe, but clearly including me in the lecture. "The compound is truffle oil, but not commercially prepared. It contains a higher-than-legal concentration of anaerobic bacteria, specifically Clostridium botulinum, type E. It was deliberately cultured." Wolfe inclined his head. "Meaning?" "Meaning someone infused the oil under conditions designed to cultivate toxin. That requires knowledge, precision, and time." "Could this have occurred naturally?" "Not likely. The environmental factors needed, lack of oxygen, certain pH and temperatures, would not occur by accident in a well-run kitchen." "Could a clerk like Mr. Pierce have created such a compound?" Volney hesitated. "If he'd had training, but this is not amateur work. Whoever produced it was meticulous and familiar with the dangers. Type E is rare. It attacks the nervous system, lethal in doses smaller than a pinhead." "Delivery method?" "The cheese, a perfect vector. The fat content binds the toxin, preserving it. It would have presented as nothing more than a particularly pungent wedge." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Volney flipped the page. "And the sample from the warehouse? Same strain, same compound, same fingerprints." I blinked. "Fingerprints? Not literal," Volney said. "Chemical signatures, matching bacterial profiles, identical contamination patterns. The truffle oil was poisoned deliberately and used again to lace the cheese near the body." Wolfe sat back, steepling his fingers. "Then," he said quietly, "the theft was to remove evidence, and the second appearance was to incriminate." Volney closed the folder and stood. "That's your play now. I've done mine." Wolfe inclined his head again, and Volney exited without another word. I turned to Wolfe. "So someone killed Dante to silence him, then used the cheese to frame Carmel?" "No," Wolfe said, "not Carmel. That was a convenient byproduct. The true target of suspicion was broader. The intent was not only to shift blame, but to erase a pattern." "Of what?" "That," Wolfe said, "is what I shall determine before midnight, or I shall eat every wheel of cheese in Fritz's pantry." And from the sound of his voice, he meant it. The address Dante had used was modest, a second-floor walk-up on 74th, above a tailor's shop that hadn't updated its window display since Roosevelt was in office. I got in using a key Marion had retrieved from the store safe, with Rigoletto's blessing and Wolfe's quiet insistence. The apartment was clean, in the way bachelor rentals often are, sparse, with unambitious furniture and a faint smell of burnt coffee. A few cookbooks lined a shelf. A corkboard near the sink had handwritten recipes tacked to it, most in Dante's small, precise script. I took a look around, careful not to disrupt the order. The desk drawer was locked. That was promising. I didn't have a key, but a thin butter knife from the kitchen, and about 5 minutes of applied pressure did the trick. Inside I found a few envelopes, all unremarkable, utilities, a dentist appointment card, and a bank statement with less than 3 digits. Then, folded inside a manila file, was a single-page letter typed on a clunky Remington, the ink faded but legible. "To whom it may concern, I have information regarding the illegal import and resale of banned culinary products through unauthorized boutique channels, specifically under the label Oro Nero. I am prepared to provide names, dates, and evidence. Payment terms must be met in full, or this goes to the Board of Health and the press." DP, I read it twice. It wasn't subtle. Dante had been blackmailing someone, and not gently. I recognized the phrase Oro Nero from one of the fake invoices I'd seen in Carmel's ledger, the same product line supposedly imported from an artisan truffle estate that didn't show up in any registry. Dante had poked a bear, and by the looks of it, that bear had fangs. I took the letter, returned the desk to its untouched state, and walked back to the brownstone, thinking about ambition. Dante hadn't been stupid, but he'd been bold. That sort of thing will get you killed faster than a spoiled moose. Back at Wolfe's, I placed the letter on his desk. He read it once, then said, "Foolish." "Which part?" "Expecting integrity from criminals," he replied. "Or mercy." Wolfe tapped the letter with a thick forefinger. "Dante Pierce," he said, "believed he was dealing with men of appetite, not men of appetite and power. He mistook a business of margins and imports for a domain of quiet dominance. That was his mistake." "You think he knew who he was blackmailing?" I asked. Wolfe shook his head. "He knew a portion. Enough to be dangerous, not enough to be safe. That is always the deadliest amount." He rose, reluctantly as always, and crossed to the globe bar for a finger of sherry, his signal that thought had resolved into decision. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "summon Saul, then call Inspector Kramer. We shall now arrange a luncheon." "A luncheon?" I blinked. "Yes," he said, sipping. "To catch a killer, and perhaps to save my anchovies." And that, I knew, was as serious as Wolfe ever got. Wolfe detests deception, except when he's the one orchestrating it. The morning after Volney's toxic confirmation and Dante's blackmail letter, he instructed me to draft invitations for a gastronomic consultation and hand-deliver them, dressed in my best approximation of sincerity. The recipients were a carefully curated list: Leo Carmel, Marion Volo, a certain health inspector named Warren Phelps, and Mr. Rigoletto himself. Saul Panzer, naturally, was present but not listed. Fritz would serve the meal and I would observe. The excuse, as fabricated by Wolfe, was elegant in its absurdity. He was considering writing a monograph on rare European food regulations and required input from respected culinary professionals and administrative minds. I wrote it with just enough pomp to sound like Wolfe and just enough vagueness to obscure the bait. Wolfe, for his part, remained seated behind his desk as I delivered the missives. He reviewed the menu with Fritz like a general approving troop movements, the pièce de résistance, a delicate mousse, soft cheese, blended with white truffle essence, precisely mimicking the original dish but made safely under Fritz's scrutiny and without a molecule of bacteria. "The same appearance," Wolfe said, "but harmless." "Unlike the one that killed Dante," I added. He gave a small nod, then returned to his book. By the time our guests arrived, the dining room had been transformed into something halfway between a food symposium and a diplomatic trap. Fritz had laid out small tasting plates on individual silver chargers. Wine glasses had been filled precisely halfway. The mousse rested innocently on the left of each plate, dusted with fresh thyme. Wolfe greeted them cordially, standing even, which meant he was already annoyed. The guests took their seats with varying degrees of confusion. Carmel wore the tight-lipped smirk of a man who expected to be flattered. Rigoletto looked suspicious but calm. Marion was tense, polite. Inspector Phelps was pale under his collar and refused Fritz's offer of sparkling water. Wolfe offered a toast to the nuances of culinary trade and the perils of overlooking them. No one knew to all what it meant. That was the point. Then the first course arrived. I stood by the bookcase with a pad in my pocket, watching the dance begin. The room was quiet, save for clinking cutlery and the occasional compliment. But the silence, like the mousse, was carefully constructed. It would not last. I've seen Wolfe pull plenty of traps in that room, some laid with silk, others with steel. This one was upholstered in linen and served with wine. But the danger was no less sharp, and the outcome, Wolfe hoped, just as conclusive. Each plate carried a near-identical replica of the cheese mousse found near Dante's body. Fritz had laboured over it for hours, obsessing over texture, temperature, and the precise floral aroma of the original truffle oil, minus the lethal microbes, of course. Wolfe had tasted it twice and pronounced it adequate. From him, that was high praise. Now, as each guest lifted forks, I kept a mental tally. Rigoletto ate first, unhesitatingly. Marion followed, eyes wary, movements small. Carmel, ever the showman, commented on the balance of the mousse with a flourish, earning a grumble from Wolfe. But Inspector Warren Phelps? He froze. He had lifted his fork, hovered it briefly, then set it back down with mechanical calm. "I'm afraid I must abstain," he said. "I have a sensitivity to dairy." That was new. According to the police records Wolfe had quietly acquired, Phelps had once been written up for expensing half a wheel of aged manchego. The man had a cheese habit rivaling Fritz's. Wolfe said nothing at first, but raised an eyebrow so minutely that only I caught it. "I regret that, Inspector," he said mildly. "The dish is quite fine and harmless." Phelps shifted in his chair. "I'm sure it is. I've simply found it best to avoid surprises." Wolfe nodded. "Surprises can be deadly." The word hung in the air like steam off broth. Saul, positioned by the hallway in the guise of a delivery man who'd stayed to observe, took a slow step forward, notebook in hand. Marion's fork paused midway to her mouth. Carmel raised both eyebrows and leaned back. Wolfe took a sip of wine, then spoke again. "I find it curious," he said, "how one can distinguish a dish's danger without tasting it." No one answered. I kept my eye on Phelps. His lips were pressed so tight they looked bloodless. And when he reached for his water, his hand shook just enough to clink the glass against the rim. Wolfe noticed too. "The mousse, Inspector," he said softly, "is missing only one ingredient. Your fear." And with that, the trap began to spring, not with a bang, but with butter knives and quiet panic. The air in the dining room had gone dense. Wolfe, of course, remained undisturbed. He'd set the hook and now waited for the line to tighten. Phelps was chewing his lower lip. Marion's eyes moved between plates like a novice chess player, realizing she was 10 moves behind. Carmel had turned theatrical, crossed arms, pouting lips, and a mild sneer. It was almost charming, if you liked your smirks with a side of fraud. Then Saul moved. Calmly, like he was strolling through the park, he stepped up beside Wolfe's chair and handed him a small, folded slip of paper. Wolfe took it, read it silently, then gestured toward the tray by his elbow. I handed it over. It was a box, plain, unmarked, save for a sticker in fine script, Oro Nero Imports, Alba Division, Piedmont, Italy. Wolfe turned to Carmel. "You know this label?" Carmel's expression didn't change. "It's truffle oil, fancy branding. We've used it." "Used?" Wolfe echoed. "It is still on your inventory sheet. 3 bottles delivered this week." "That's possible," Carmel allowed. "What of it?" Wolfe tilted his head. "This label," he said, "was discontinued 6 years ago when the Alba division folded after a contamination scandal. The registry is defunct. The trademark has not been renewed. In short, Mr. Carmel, it does not exist." Saul stepped forward and added in his quiet baritone, "The label on your bottles is counterfeit. I've seen the originals. These have a false lot number and the wrong seal placement." "You're mistaken," Carmel said, too quickly. "No," Saul said. "You are." Wolfe picked up the small bottle Saul had provided, one he had retrieved that morning from the back of Carmel's storeroom, and held it delicately between thumb and forefinger. "This," he said, "matches the bacterial strain found in the warehouse where Mr. Pierce was killed." Carmel went still. "There is a network," Wolfe said. "Someone is smuggling unregulated food product, likely to avoid taxes or health scrutiny, and laundering it through boutique shops under fraudulent branding. Dante discovered it. He threatened exposure, and he died." He turned slightly in his chair. "The question now, Mr. Carmel, is whether you are a participant or a pawn." "I don't—" Carmel began, then stopped. The room was too quiet for denial. Wolfe's gaze flicked to Phelps, or whether someone higher ensured silence. That's when the front bell rang. You could set your watch by Inspector Kramer's timing, always inconvenient, always impatient, and always preceded by a growl. Fritz, grim but composed, appeared at the dining room threshold with his usual deadpan delivery. "Inspector Kramer," he said. "Uninvited." Wolfe made no move to rise. "Show him in." Kramer entered with the bearing of a man expecting nonsense and already tired of it. He took one look at the spread, the cast of characters, and the atmosphere of accusation hovering above the moose like steam, and his face crumpled into full scowl mode. "I should have known," he said. "You throw a luncheon and someone's about to get buried." Wolfe offered a nod. "I see the force has learned deductive reasoning." Kramer pointed a thick finger at the moose. "You feeding poison again?" "On the contrary," Wolfe said, "we've removed it." Kramer's eyes narrowed. "What am I walking into?" I gave him a quick summary, leaving out just enough to irritate him. Saul, as always, handed over a document, this time a list of shipments traced to Oro Nero imports and matching dates to Carmel's receiving logs. Kramer flipped through it, grunted, and turned to Phelps. "Inspector?" Phelps didn't answer. His hands were under the table. Wolfe leaned forward, softly. Inspector Phelps declined the moose, not out of dietary sensitivity, but because he recognized its significance. Kramer squinted. "Which is?" "It replicates the poison," Wolfe said. "Exactly." "A test, Inspector. And our colleague here failed it." Kramer folded his arms. "And you're telling me this ties him to Dante Pierce's murder?" "I will show you," Wolfe replied. "In precisely 6 minutes." Kramer sighed and reached for a breadstick. "Fine," he muttered, "but if you try to pin this on a cheese wheel, I'm walking out." Wolfe smiled. That was as close to cooperation as he'd ever get from Inspector Kramer. And the trap? It was now very much in motion. The moment Kramer finished crunching his breadstick, Wolfe raised a hand. Silence, already hanging by a thread, snapped taut. "Gentlemen," Wolfe said, "and Miss Volo. You were brought here not only to assist me in an absurd pretext involving European food labeling. You were brought here to expose a murder." Rigoletto's eyes widened. Carmel muttered something under his breath. Phelps shifted again, the same inch-by-inch slide of a man wishing his chair were farther from scrutiny. Wolfe continued, "The moose you were served is an exact replica of the one found beside Dante Pierce's body, not in taste. In presentation, Kramer leaned forward. So you poisoned your guests?" "Don't be dense," Wolfe replied, almost kindly. "It is harmless, but it was presented as though it were not." He paused. "Every one of you, save one, tasted it. That was not a matter of palate. It was a matter of knowledge." Phelps cleared his throat. "I told you, I have a sensitivity." "Which developed conveniently between the manchego you consumed last month and this morning?" Wolfe asked. Kramer turned to Phelps. "You didn't mention a dairy issue." "Some things are personal." "Indeed," Wolfe said. "Fear is very personal." Marion stood, trembling. "Inspector, he knew. He told me last week that a routine inspection was coming, but Rigoletto's wasn't on the list." Wolfe nodded. "Because it wasn't routine. It was targeted, meant to distract, to shield someone else's activity." Saul stepped forward and placed 2 photographs on the table. One showed a shipping manifest from a warehouse in Hoboken. The other showed Phelps speaking to a delivery driver outside Carmel's shop. Same driver, same day. Kramer stared at the photos, then turned slowly to Phelps. "You care to explain this?" Phelps opened his mouth and closed it again. Wolfe rose. Dante Pierce discovered an illegal supply chain. He thought he could leverage that knowledge. Instead, he was silenced by someone who knew how to use a toxin and a cold locker. Phelps's hand trembled as he reached for his water glass. It tipped, clattering against the charger. Rigoletto spoke, low. "You killed him." Carmel, for once, said nothing. Wolfe sat again. "Inspector Kramer, I believe you now have enough." Kramer nodded grimly. "Yeah, I think I do." After the statements were taken and Phelps was led, silent and pale, to the door with Kramer at his flank, the room cleared quickly. Carmel declined coffee. Rigoletto apologized for the drama and left with Marion, whose expression had shifted from worry to resignation. Fritz began collecting dishes like a man reasserting dominion over a world that had momentarily unraveled. Wolfe remained at the table, his massive frame settled like a boulder unmoved by the storm. I leaned against the bookshelf, waiting. "You didn't accuse him directly," I said. "No," Wolfe replied. "But I didn't need to. The moose did it." He reached for the wine glass and took a small, satisfied sip. "Psychological traps," he murmured, "require silence as bait, not force." I nodded. "You knew he wouldn't eat it." It was a certainty. He had touched death with that dish. To face it again, even in imitation, would be unbearable. And the photos? Saul's final stroke, proof of proximity, motive, means and presence, the trifecta. There was a long pause. Fritz entered quietly and poured Wolfe a second glass. "I assume," Wolfe said, "that my anchovy supply shall remain undisturbed." "You've saved it," I said. "And the city's boutique cheese trade?" Wolfe grunted. Then faintly, just enough for me to catch it, a small curl of his lips. Triumph, in Wolfe's world, never needed applause, only truth. Wolfe's office has played host to more confessions, confrontations, and psychological collapses than most courthouses, and that afternoon it resumed its regular function as an intellectual execution chamber. The chairs were arranged in a semicircle, Marion Volo, Leo Carmel, Rigoletto, and reluctantly escorted by a pair of plainclothesmen from Midtown South, a grey-faced Warren Phelps. Kramer stood at the bookcase with his arms folded, chewing an unlit cigar and wearing his usual expression of civic irritation. Wolfe, seated at his desk, did not rise. That would have implied urgency, and urgency was for lesser men. He looked around the room, letting silence settle like a fine dust. Fritz stood just outside the door, and Saul sat quietly at the rear, still and watchful. "Thank you all," Wolfe began, "for returning." No one thanked him back. "I have arranged this meeting," he continued, "to illuminate what transpired in the days leading to Dante Pierce's death, and to clarify the motive, means, and minds behind it." Rigoletto cleared his throat. "Then you know who killed him?" Wolfe glanced at him. "Yes." No flourish, just fact. "However," he said, "before we reach that terminal point, the context must be constructed. We are, after all, civilized." I was by the Globe Bar, pad in hand, doing what I do best, looking sharp and staying quiet. Wolfe's eyes moved to Phelps, who was sweating through his collar. Carmel sat rigidly, but his fingers tapped a steady rhythm on the armrest. Marion's hands were laced tightly in her lap. No one moved. Wolfe cleared his throat and began. "There is a fantasy," Wolfe said, "that the gourmet trade is a genteel profession, a realm of fussy ephemera, cheese, oils, wines, served with charm and civility. In truth, it is as cutthroat as diamonds or pharmaceuticals, particularly where import and authenticity are concerned." He gestured toward the side table, where 3 items had been carefully placed: the vial of truffle oil, the forged shipping manifest, and a wedge of untouched moose wrapped in wax. "These are not culinary ornaments," he said. "They are instruments of deception." He turned to Marion. "Mr. Pierce discovered that Oro Nero, the label under which truffle oils and cheeses were being sold, was a fiction, a ghost brand, shut down years ago after a botulism scare in Piedmont. Yet the bottles reappeared, with fresh seals, fraudulent lot numbers, and no import taxes." Kramer grunted. "And someone was making a killing." "Indeed," Wolfe said, "until Dante attempted one of his own." He shifted his gaze to Phelps. "Dante Pierce was not a blackmailer by profession, but desperation, like truffle oil, brings out strong notes under pressure. He wrote a letter, unsigned but unmistakable, threatening to expose the illegal supply chain unless compensated. Wolfe turned back to his desk, folded his hands. He delivered that letter to the only person in the chain who could silence it without consequence, the health inspector overseeing boutique shop certifications, Mr. Phelps. Phelps flinched, but said nothing. He believed Phelps would be afraid. He was mistaken. Phelps was not afraid. He was angry, and in possession of all the access necessary to neutralize the threat. Kramer's brow twitched. How? By staging a warning, Wolfe said. The initial break-in at Rigoletto's was theatre, a planted note, a missing cheese wheel, designed to divert suspicion toward a rival. But when Dante persisted, the response escalated. He was lured to Carmel's warehouse under pretense of cooperation. There he was killed, his body stored in cold preservation, a contaminated mousse placed beside him to mock the threat. Wolfe picked up the second vial. This strain of Clostridium botulinum did not originate from poor storage. It was cultured, bottled, distributed. Phelps made a faint sound in his throat. Carmel burst out. I had no part in it. I sell what I'm told. Wolfe nodded once. You were a pawn, Mr. Carmel. Profiting, perhaps, but not planning. The orchestration, the forgery of labels, the suppression of inspections at certain shops, and the framing of a rival required someone inside the system, someone whose signature could blind the eyes meant to protect the public. He leaned back in his chair. Mr. Phelps recognized the mousse. That is why he refused to taste it. All eyes turned to the inspector, who now looked 10 years older and a foot shorter. Kramer stepped forward, slow and deliberate. I'll take it from here, he said, voice low. Wolfe gave a small nod. The room was silent, but I could feel it. The walls had shifted, the trap had closed. And Wolfe? He hadn't raised his voice once. Kramer stood silent, arms crossed, as Wolfe settled deeper into his chair, the fingertips of both hands pressed lightly together. He was far from finished. The elegance of the scheme, Wolfe said, lay in its layering. Mr. Pierce was not murdered in haste. He was maneuvered. He turned his eyes to Phelps, who was now glassy-eyed and motionless. Dante Pierce, in attempting to extort his silence fee, delivered his threat to a man already entangled in a network of fraudulent supply. Mr. Phelps, tasked with protecting food safety, had instead become its most valuable shield. He enabled Oro Nero's re-entry into the market, allowed uninspected shipments to bypass scrutiny, and provided cover through selective enforcement. Kramer growled, We've got inspectors looking into that now. Wolfe gave him a flicker of acknowledgement. Indeed, but let us follow the logic. Mr. Pierce delivers his threat. Phelps, under pressure, decides to stage a misdirection. The break-in at Rigoletto's was designed to appear minor, a targeted theft, a warning to Dante, but Dante, unfortunately, did not interpret it as such. He persisted. Thus, escalation. I interjected. The real kill switch. Wolfe nodded. Correct. Mr. Pierce was summoned under a pretext we have not yet uncovered, but undoubtedly one involving his supposed leverage. Once inside the warehouse's cold locker, he was subdued. No marks, no violence, just placement alongside the poisoned mousse, symbolic and efficient. He turned back to the desk and tapped the manifest from Carmel's inventory. The mousse was not merely planted for theatricality, it also served to direct attention elsewhere. By mimicking the Rigoletto break-in, it would seem the rivalry had turned lethal. Mr. Carmel, pompous though he may be, was an easy suspect. Hey, Carmel began. Wolfe silenced him with a glance. However, what the killer did not anticipate was the forensic traceability of the bacteria strain, or that Mr. Goodwin would recover a vial at Rigoletto's matching that found near the body. The bacteria was the same, the oil the same, but the location... He turned slowly to Marion. You recall finding that second vial? Yes, she said softly, near the back shelf, where the anchovies were stored. And you did not put it there? Of course not. Wolfe nodded again. Then we must ask, who did? And why was it planted in a location Mr. Phelps had no reason to access? Kramer took out his notebook. "And your answer?" Wolfe leaned back. "The answer," he said, "is in the misstep. In staging a frame," Wolfe continued, "the killer must be precise. Where to plant evidence, how to guide suspicion, what to remove. But in this case, Mr. Phelps erred." He turned to Kramer. "The contaminated truffle oil found at Rigoletto's was meant to suggest complicity, or at minimum, contamination due to negligence. But Rigoletto's was not part of the distribution ring. The oil had no reason to be there. It had not appeared in any invoices. No customers had requested it. And yet, there it sat, behind a shelf, near a box of anchovies." "Exactly where Fritz would look," I added. Wolfe inclined his head. "Yes, that was the misstep." Kramer looked up. "So the vial was meant for Carmel's, but got planted at Rigoletto's instead?" "Precisely. Mr. Phelps, under pressure, either confused the location or acted hastily. He planted a contaminated vial to make it appear that Rigoletto's had purchased dangerous product, but Fritz, whose taste and precision are beyond reproach, noticed immediately. That discrepancy led Mr. Goodwin to examine the area more closely, and that led to everything else." Marion's eyes widened. "So the whole thing, Dante's death, the cheese, the frame-up, it all unraveled because someone didn't know where Fritz keeps his anchovies?" "Correct," Wolfe said, "which is why I never underestimate a cook." Kramer let out a low whistle. "All this because one man wanted to hush a blackmailer and protect his racket." Wolfe said nothing. Saul stepped forward with the final invoice, the one showing a forged delivery from Oro Nero, dated the day after Dante disappeared, with Phelps's signature confirming receipt and inspection. "Dated the day after," Wolfe said calmly. "A document created after the murder to cover the removal of evidence." Kramer took it, glanced over the details, and muttered, "That'll do." Wolfe leaned back once more. Mr. Phelps did not anticipate the persistence of flavor or of evidence. I looked at him. "So it was the oil that tripped him?" "No," Wolfe said. "It was the arrogance." Phelps said nothing. He was no longer sweating. He was simply quiet. Wolfe folded his hands. "I believe," he said, "we may now proceed to justice." And no one in the room dared disagree. Wolfe sat motionless, his bulk settled in the red leather chair, as if the last hour had been spent in idle conversation rather than a meticulous flaying of deception. But I knew the signs. His right eyebrow had lifted by exactly 3 millimeters, and his fingers now steepled with a sharpness that meant one more card was yet to be played. "Mr. Phelps," he said, "you made a grave error in assuming silence could be maintained indefinitely." Phelps didn't answer. His lips had flattened into a white line. Saul, who'd been seated at the far end of the room until now, rose with Wolfe's subtle nod. From his inner pocket he drew a small reel of magnetic tape and a typed transcript. He passed both to Wolfe, then retreated. Wolfe unfolded the paper. 2 days ago," he said, "Mr. Panzer intercepted a telephone call routed through a third-party relay service. The call was placed from a number registered to your office line at the Department of Health." He looked up. The content of that call was an order confirmation, a shipment containing 2 cases of false-labeled Oro Nero truffle oil was to be received at a private warehouse in Long Island. Delivery time, 10:30 p.m. this evening. Phelps exhaled slowly, as if trying to release something deeper than air. "I need not point out," Wolfe continued, "that arranging delivery of contraband gourmet goods while under suspicion of murder and fraud is ill-advised." Kramer took the tape and transcript from Wolfe, flipping through the top sheet. His jaw tightened. Phelps's voice cracked. "You can't prove I killed him." "No," Wolfe said, "but the toxin can. The oil from that delivery, once tested, will match the strain in your forged sample. You delivered death in a delicacy, and like most things consumed hastily, it left evidence behind." Phelps stared at the floor. His hands, resting on his knees, slowly curled inward. Wolfe leaned back, satisfied. Kramer didn't need a confession, not now. "Let's go," he said flatly. Phelps rose with the mechanical grace of a man who'd already lost every card. As the officers guided him out, Wolfe closed his eyes. The room exhaled. I scribbled a final note in my pad. There are many ways to poison a man. One of them is with silence, and Wolfe had served it chilled. That evening, the brownstone took on the rarest of atmospheres, one of mutual contentment. No open cases, no corpses in cold lockers, no inspectors at the door, just Fritz in the kitchen, rattling pots like cymbals in a private orchestra. The dining room was set with extra polish down to the antique silver salt cellars Wolfe insisted on using when he felt expansive. I was already seated, napkin in lap, when Fritz emerged with the dish of the hour. It was, in theory, a celebration. There, on the center of each plate, sat the very thing that had poisoned a man, unspooled a conspiracy, and nearly interrupted Wolfe's anchovy supply, truffle mousse, made fresh, made safe, and made right. Wolfe regarded it without comment. Fritz beamed. His version of a full grin was a subtle lift at one corner of the mouth, and stood by until Wolfe took the first bite. I followed suit. The mousse was smooth, airy, and finished with the faint, earthy perfume of white truffle. If guilt had a flavor, it had been replaced here by redemption. I raised my fork for another helping and leaned back. "Well," I said, "I don't usually thank a corpse for dinner, but Dante Pierce had taste." Wolfe did not respond. He merely cut another delicate slice with surgical precision and placed it on his tongue. It is a peculiar truth that when Nero Wolfe is most satisfied, he speaks the least. That evening, no lecture emerged on the merits of restraint in truffle pairings, no commentary on the nutritional imbalance of mousse as a main course, no declaration of intellectual supremacy, though he'd earned it in full. Instead, he ate. With the quiet deliberation of a man confirming order had been restored, Wolfe moved from mousse to sautéed greens, from greens to a thin slice of brioche Fritz had toasted just enough to flirt with caramelization. A sip of chilled Riesling punctuated the cadence. I watched him as I ate. Not out of concern, he'd had more dangerous meals, but because this was one of those rare glimpses into the man behind the ponderous rituals and relentless logic. No bluster, no bravado, only satisfaction. Eventually he leaned back, fingertips resting lightly on the table's edge, eyes half closed. For a moment I thought he might actually compliment Fritz aloud. He did not. But he did refill his wine glass, and that in the Wolfe household was practically applause. I sat back, swirling the last of my own wine, and watched him for a moment longer. "You know," I said, "I've seen you bring down blackmailers, frauds, art thieves, and murderers. But this is the first time you've used cheese as a murder weapon, and solved it with a mousse." He didn't open his eyes. Pfui. That's not a denial. He reached for his napkin, dabbed at the corner of his mouth, and said, "When idiocy is seasoned with arrogance, it is rarely palatable." "Well," I replied, "at least tonight's dish didn't kill anyone, except maybe my diet." He grunted. I leaned forward slightly, refolding my napkin with flair. "Still, you have to admit, when it comes to murder and mousse, you always eat last and win." Wolfe said nothing, but one corner of his mouth twitched. Victory acknowledged. Fritz had just returned with a fresh bottle when the phone rang. Not once, not twice, but with the insistent tempo of a problem arriving uninvited. Wolfe closed his eyes. "Archie," he said, voice heavy with dread, "answer it." I sighed and rose, wine still in hand. If it's a florist, I'm changing careers. It wasn't. I returned a moment later. A woman, hysterical, something about her husband vanishing from a locked room, and a gardener with a grudge. Wolfe groaned. Fritz poured the wine anyway. I lifted my glass. "To digestion." Wolfe raised his reluctantly. The toast never landed, because outside the brownstone a car door slammed, followed by footsteps on the walk. I looked toward the hallway and grinned. "Looks like dessert's been postponed."